The night sky over Russia's Far East suddenly turned black. A massive explosion ripped through the main thermal power plant on Sakhalin Island, the nation's easternmost stronghold near Japan. Within minutes, more than 100,000 civilians and soldiers were plunged into darkness. It was October 27, 2025, and the lights that went out that night exposed something far greater than a technical failure. They revealed how fragile Vladimir Putin's empire has become. Reports from Reuters and DW confirm that 8 major cities, including Yuzhno-Sakhalinsk, the island's capital, went completely offline. Entire neighborhoods froze in silence. For hours, there was no electricity, no heat, no communication. Eyewitnesses described it as a night when time stopped. Yet this was no ordinary blackout. The explosions at the plant were so intense that they lit up the sky, shaking windows miles away. Officials rushed to label it a local malfunction, but the reality on the ground told a different story. Sakhalin is no ordinary territory, strategically located between the Sea of Okhotsk and the Pacific Ocean. Just a short distance from Japan's Hokkaido Island, it serves as one of Russia's most fortified military zones. It houses air defense systems, S-400 missile batteries, radar installations, and naval bases for the Pacific Fleet. It is Moscow's unsinkable aircraft carrier, the cornerstone of Putin's eastern defense line. That is why this blackout sent shockwaves through the Kremlin. While Putin was smiling for cameras in Beijing with Xi Jinping and shaking hands with Kim Jong-un in Pyongyang, the island guarding his Pacific flank was collapsing into chaos. Analysts from Defense News warn that such a failure at a critical site could cripple Russia's command and control operations in the east. The timing couldn't have been worse, coming just as Ukraine intensified strikes on Russia's energy network. For decades, Moscow portrayed Sakhalin as a symbol of strength, proof that Russia could defend its interests in the Pacific. But as power grids failed and military radars went dark, that image began to crumble. Was this truly an accident, or a message sent from within Russia itself? The question now gripping Moscow's security circles is simple but terrifying. If the empire's farthest fortress can be paralyzed overnight, what comes next? The night sky above Russia's Far East suddenly went dark. A thunderous explosion tore through the main thermal power plant on Sakhalin Island, the country's easternmost outpost near Japan. Within minutes, more than 100,000 civilians and soldiers were plunged into darkness. It was October 27, 2025, and the lights that vanished that night exposed something far greater than a technical failure. They revealed the growing weakness inside Vladimir Putin's empire. According to Reuters and DW, 8 major cities, including Yuzhno-Sakhalinsk, the island's capital, lost all power. Entire neighborhoods froze in silence. There was no electricity, no heat, no communication. Residents described a night when time stopped. The blast illuminated the sky for miles, shattering windows and setting off alarms across the coastline. Officials rushed to label it a mere malfunction, yet the damage pattern told another story, one of precision and intent. Sakhalin is not a distant wilderness. It is a fortress. Positioned between the Sea of Okhotsk and the Pacific Ocean, only a few kilometers from Japan's Hokkaido Island, it hosts S-400 missile batteries, radar arrays, naval docks and airfields belonging to the Pacific Fleet. For Moscow, the island is an unsinkable aircraft carrier, the cornerstone of its defense in East Asia. That is why this blackout struck the Kremlin like an earthquake. While Putin posed in Beijing beside Xi Jinping and shook hands with Kim Jong-un in Pyongyang, the base safeguarding his Pacific flank was collapsing into chaos. Analysts from Defense News warned that any prolonged outage could paralyze radar networks, communication hubs, and command centers across the region. The timing was ominous. It came just as Ukraine intensified its attacks on Russia's energy grid. For years, the Kremlin portrayed Sakhalin as proof that Russia could project power across the Pacific. But as its radars dimmed and runways went black, that myth began to fall apart. Was this truly an accident, or a deliberate strike meant to expose Russia's vulnerability? The question echoing through Moscow tonight is simple yet terrifying. If the empire's farthest fortress can be silenced overnight, what or who will fall next? If this explosion was no accident, then who pulled the trigger? The Sakhalin disaster has forced Russian intelligence to face its deepest fear that the real threat may not come from Kiev or Washington, but from within Russia itself. Investigators from the FSB were dispatched within hours, yet even their presence could not hide the growing sense of panic. The Kremlin's official narrative that a technical fault caused the blast quickly collapsed under scrutiny. Too many details didn't fit. The timing, the precision, the scale all pointed to something far more organized. According to Reuters and BBC Moscow's early reports downplayed the incident, but satellite images later showed two separate explosion points within the plant's infrastructure. That kind of coordinated impact is nearly impossible without insider knowledge. Energy experts say that thermal power facilities are built with multiple backup systems and reinforced safeguards. For such a catastrophic chain reaction to occur, someone either bypassed or deliberately disabled these protections. And that brings us to the most alarming possibility: internal sabotage. For years, rumors circulated about anti-war partisans and resistance cells forming deep inside Russia, citizens outraged by the endless casualties, falling wages, and the suffocating reach of state censorship. Groups like the Russian Freedom Legion and the Siberian Battalion have claimed sporadic attacks on military offices, train lines, and fuel depots. Now, security analysts fear that this wave of internal defiance has reached Sakhalin itself, thousands of kilometers away from the Ukrainian front. Such a strike would represent a terrifying new chapter in Russia's unraveling. Imagine what it means: trained engineers or insiders on a remote island choosing to sabotage their own government's infrastructure. It would suggest that loyalty to the Kremlin is crumbling even among those tasked with keeping the lights on. Economic exhaustion, war fatigue, and fear of mobilization have all eroded the public's patience. For many Russians, the war that once felt distant has finally come home. And when ordinary citizens decide that the only way to be heard is through destruction, no amount of propaganda or repression can restore control. As Defense News analysts put it, Sakhalin was supposed to be Russia's safest zone. If resistance reached that far, no corner of the country is secure. The Kremlin may not admit it, but this explosion has exposed a truth it cannot suppress. The war is no longer only on the battlefield, it's inside Russia itself. When the lights went out on Sakhalin, it wasn't just homes that went dark. Russia's Pacific defenses went blind. Every modern weapon system, from long-range radars to missile batteries, depends on a stable energy grid. Without it, a military base becomes nothing more than metal and silence. The explosion at the Yuzhno-Sakhalinsk thermal power plant crippled that grid. For hours, radars failed, air defense screens flickered off, and command centers were forced to rely on aging backup generators. Analysts at Defense News and Jane's Defense Weekly warn that in wartime conditions, even a temporary power failure can lead to strategic paralysis. The Pacific Fleet, home to some of Russia's most advanced warships and submarines, suddenly found itself isolated. Communications with Moscow were unstable, radar coverage over the Sea of Okhotsk dropped, and naval traffic monitoring systems partially collapsed. It was as if the eastern edge of the Russian Empire had been unplugged from its own defense network. This blackout also hit the S-400 air defense systems stationed on the island. These powerful batteries, designed to detect and intercept potential threats from Japan or the United States, rely heavily on continuous radar and data synchronization. Without full power, their detection range shrinks dramatically. In military terms, that means blind spots, open corridors where enemy aircraft could theoretically pass unnoticed. The same risk extended to the runways of Sakhalin's air bases, where Su-35 fighters and anti-submarine aircraft are stationed. Emergency runway lights flickered out during the first critical minutes after the blast, grounding all takeoffs. Naval docks, already under strain from logistics shortages, halted operations as cranes and fuel pumps lost power. The island's so-called unsinkable aircraft carrier was sinking not from missiles, but from the collapse of its own lifeline, electricity. Inside the Kremlin, panic spread quietly. Intelligence updates described unacceptable vulnerabilities along the eastern perimeter. In the event of a second strike, whether by sabotage or foreign force, Russia would have limited means to respond. And if Japan or US reconnaissance assets were watching, they now had a clear view of just how fragile Moscow's Far East defenses truly were. What began as an energy failure had now evolved into a military nightmare. A fortress that could not see, hear, or communicate was no fortress at all. The blackout had turned Sakhalin into the most dangerous kind of target, one that could not defend itself. As the military struggled to restore control, ordinary citizens on Sakhalin Island faced a far more immediate crisis survival. The explosion had plunged more than 100,000 people into total darkness. With temperatures falling below freezing, power outages became a matter of life and death. The thermal plant that had once kept homes warm and lights glowing now stood as a twisted shell of steel and ash. For many, this was the first time the distant war had touched their lives directly. According to BBC and Reuters, the blackout spread across 8 cities, cutting electricity, heating and communication lines. Hospitals operated on emergency generators, their corridors lit by dim yellow bulbs. Doctors performed surgeries under portable lamps, while nurses carried water by hand when pumps failed. In the suburbs of Yuzhno-Sakhalinsk, families wrapped themselves in coats and blankets, trying to stay warm as night temperatures plunged. The silence was unsettling. Without power, there was no internet, no radio, and no public transport. Entire neighborhoods fell into isolation. Supermarkets couldn't preserve food, ATMs stopped working, and phone networks collapsed. Within 48 hours, reports of water shortages and food spoilage began to surface. The sense of fear grew not just of the cold, but of what might come next. For years, people on Sakhalin had believed the war in Ukraine was a distant spectacle, something to be watched on television. Now that illusion was shattered. The war has reached us, one resident told DW. We realize that we are not safe anywhere in Russia. This shift in perception may prove more devastating to the Kremlin than the explosion itself. Fear has become anger, and anger is spreading faster than any power outage. The local economy also began to suffocate. Fishing fleets remained docked, refineries paused production, and gas exports, a key source of income for the island, were delayed. Salaries went unpaid as factories shut down. Analysts estimate that every day without full power costs the island millions in lost productivity. But perhaps the most dangerous effect is psychological. For the first time, many Russians far from the front lines began to question the government's control. If Moscow cannot protect a fortified island, how can it protect the rest of the country? Inside their darkened homes, Sakhalin's people were not just waiting for electricity to return, they were waiting for answers. And as rumors of sabotage and betrayal spread, one question echoed through every frozen street: has Russia already begun to collapse from within? As daylight finally returned to Sakhalin, the damage became undeniable. Entire districts lay paralyzed. Power lines hung lifeless, and smoke still rose from the shell of the destroyed thermal plant. But what frightened the Kremlin most wasn't the physical wreckage, it was what the explosion revealed. Russia's illusion of control had shattered. Officials in Moscow scrambled to reassert authority, sending investigators, engineers, and even Rosgvardia units to secure the island. But restoring order proved harder than expected. Local administrators hesitated to speak, fearing they'd be accused of negligence or disloyalty. Independent outlets like Meduza and BBC Russian reported quiet evacuations of sensitive equipment from radar and naval sites, an implicit admission that the Far East defenses were compromised. Meanwhile, international observers were watching closely. Japan's defense ministry called an emergency meeting to assess whether the blackout had weakened Russian monitoring in the region. For Tokyo, Sakhalin's failure was both a warning and an opportunity. Analysts at the Japan Times wrote that the incident exposed significant gaps in Russian operational resilience, prompting Japan to expand surveillance flights over the Sea of Okhotsk. Even South Korea reportedly increased intelligence sharing with the United States Pacific Command, sensing a rare window of vulnerability in Moscow's Eastern Theater. Back in Russia, the psychological impact deepened. The idea that sabotage could reach so far from Ukraine, nearly 7,000 kilometers from the front, shook public confidence to the core. Rumors spread that local insiders possibly linked to anti-war cells had orchestrated the explosion. The FSB launched mass interrogations detaining dozens, yet failed to produce clear evidence. The silence from official media only made the fear louder. Inside the Kremlin, advisors warned Putin that this was no isolated event. Energy sabotage, cyber attacks, and internal resistance could erupt anywhere. Protecting thousands of strategic facilities across the world's largest nation was impossible. Every new explosion, every blackout would now serve as a reminder that Russia's power, both military and symbolic, is crumbling under its own weight. For the outside world, the blast on Sakhalin is more than a local disaster. It signals that the war's ripple effects have reached the Pacific, pulling the entire balance of power in East Asia into question. If an empire cannot keep its lights on, how long before its borders too begin to fade? The blackout on Sakhalin is not just a regional incident, it is a reflection of a much deeper fracture within the Russian state. An explosion thousands of kilometers from Ukraine revealed that the Kremlin's greatest weakness isn't an external enemy but its own decay. When power grids collapse, when military bases fall silent, and when ordinary citizens lose faith in their leaders, no propaganda can hide the truth. Across Russia, unease is spreading. From the Baltic to the Pacific, whispers of sabotage and rebellion grow louder. The question is no longer whether the empire can win abroad, but whether it can survive at home. Analysts from Reuters and DW note that the pattern is unmistakable. Every blackout, every explosion, every protest brings the center one step closer to breaking. For Vladimir Putin, the war he began to demonstrate strength is now consuming his image piece by piece. The Kremlin may restore power, but it cannot restore trust. And in a nation where silence replaces truth, even the hum of a generator feels like defiance. So what happens next? Will the darkness that engulfed Sakhalin spread to new corners of Russia? Could the next target be a refinery in Siberia, or perhaps a command center near Moscow itself? One thing is clear, the lights may come back on, but the fear will not fade. If you found this analysis eye-opening, let us know your thoughts below. Do you believe Russia's collapse has already begun? From within, subscribe to stay informed, because this story is far from over.